There's a moment, somewhere between the third and fourth hour, inside Mount Massive Asylum, where Miles Upshur stops running toward the exit and starts running toward something else entirely. His camera battery is nearly dead. His fingers, what remains of them, throb with pain that no amount of adrenaline can fully suppress. Every door he opens reveals something worse than what came before. And yet he keeps filming, keeps documenting, keeps pushing deeper into a nightmare that any rational person would have abandoned long ago. That moment is when survival stops being about escape and starts being about something far more complicated. When the journalist inside him fuses with the trauma, when documentation becomes the only thing holding his mind together, when bearing witness matters more than breathing. Tonight we're going deep into the psychology of the investigative reporter who entered Mount Massive Asylum to expose corporate evil and left as something no longer entirely human. We'll explore what happens to a mind forced to witness systematic horror while remaining powerless to stop it, how trauma reshapes identity in real time, and what it means when the ultimate violation isn't death, but the loss of autonomy over your own body. If you find something in this video that resonates with you, drop a comment letting me know what part connected, whether it was a specific psychological concept, something about Miles's choices that made sense to you, or just a moment that stuck. So now settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Man Who Couldn't Look Away. Before Mount Massive, before the Wall Rider, before everything shattered, Miles Upshur was a journalist with a problem. He couldn't let things go. Somewhere in his professional history, he'd posted material about Afghanistan that his employer deemed unacceptable, material offensive enough or controversial enough to get him fired from a regular journalism position. After that termination, he went freelance, operating without the constraints of editorial oversight, without the safety net of institutional backing, without anyone telling him which stories were too dangerous to chase. That firing tells us something crucial about Miles's psychology. Most journalists who lose stable positions for pushing boundaries make a choice afterward. They either moderate their approach to regain employability, or they double down and accept the consequences of operating on the margins. Miles doubled down. He became the kind of investigative reporter who digs into stories no other journalist would touch, who treats risk as cost of admission rather than warning sign, who measures success by impact rather than safety. This pattern suggests a personality structure organized around a few core convictions. Miles believes truth matters more than comfort. He believes exposure creates accountability, that shining light into dark places actually changes outcomes. He believes someone needs to do the work of witnessing, even when that work is dangerous, even when it costs more than it pays, even when no one asked him to do it. These aren't casual beliefs. They're the kind of foundational assumptions that shape entire lives, that determine which opportunities you pursue and which warnings you ignore. Living in Washington, D.C. before Mount Massive placed Miles at the center of investigative journalism's ecosystem. The capital attracts reporters who chase power, who want proximity to government decisions, and corporate lobbying and the machinery that shapes policy. But Miles wasn't covering congressional hearings or interviewing officials. He was freelance, which meant he was chasing stories outside the approved channels, following leads that came from anonymous sources, building narratives from fragments that mainstream outlets wouldn't touch without 3 layers of verification and legal review. When the anonymous email arrived, containing allegations of human rights violations at a remote psychiatric facility in Colorado, providing just enough detail to suggest the source had inside access, most journalists would have forwarded it to authorities or to a publication with resources for investigation and legal protection. Miles did neither. He packed his camera, flew to Colorado, and prepared to break into a secure facility at night based solely on an anonymous tip. This decision reveals the core of Miles's psychology. He has extraordinarily high tolerance for risk combined with apparently low concern for consequences. That combination appears in a few personality profiles. Thrill seekers chase danger for the adrenaline, for the feeling of being alive that comes from proximity to death. Idealists chase danger because the cause matters more than personal safety, because some principles are worth dying for. And then there are people for whom the work itself, the investigation, the documentation, the act of uncovering hidden truth, has become so central to identity that stopping feels like self-erasure. Miles fits that third category. His ambition isn't about fame or recognition. The game's prologue describes him as ambitious, but that ambition manifests as compulsion. He needs to investigate the way some people need to create art or solve equations. Journalism isn't separate from who he is. It's the scaffolding holding his entire sense of self together. Take away his ability to investigate, to document, to expose, and you're not just taking his profession. You're dismantling his identity. Walking toward Mount Massive in darkness, camera in hand, Miles represents something psychology calls overvalued ideation. An overvalued idea sits between normal conviction and delusional belief. It's not quite a delusion because the idea isn't impossible or contradicted by reality, but it's also not quite a healthy conviction because the idea has become so dominant that it overrides self-preservation, distorts judgment, and makes the person unable to engage with competing priorities. For Miles, the overvalued idea is that truth must be documented, that bearing witness is a moral imperative, that someone has to do this work regardless of personal cost. The email from Wayland Park, though Miles doesn't know the source at this point, alleges psychiatric patient abuse, unethical experimentation, and corporate corruption hiding behind charity. These allegations trigger everything Miles believes journalism exists to expose. Powerful institutions exploiting vulnerable populations, secrets protected by isolation and money, victims with no voice, no advocates, no way to make their suffering visible to a world that might care if it only knew. For Miles, this isn't just a story, it's a calling. And that framing, that sense of moral mission embedded in professional identity, is going to be what keeps him alive through impossible odds, and also what ensures he can never truly escape. His equipment choice matters psychologically. He brings a camcorder, not just a notebook. Video documentation carries weight that written reporting can't match. You can dismiss testimony, question written accounts, argue about interpretation. But the video shows you what happened. It transforms abstract allegations into visceral reality. Miles understands this instinctively. The camera isn't just a tool, it's a weapon against denial, a way of forcing people to see what they'd prefer to ignore. The camcorder also provides psychological distance. When experiencing trauma directly, the mind can fracture under the weight of what it's processing. But experiencing trauma through a lens, through the mediation of technology, creates just enough separation to remain functional. The camera becomes a buffer, allowing Miles to witness unbearable things while maintaining the fiction that he is not quite experiencing them himself, that he's documenting rather than enduring, that he's an observer rather than a participant. This coping mechanism will become crucial as the night progresses, as the things Miles witnesses escalate from disturbing to catastrophic. The camera doesn't just record the asylum's horrors, it protects Miles's mind from shattering completely under their weight. As long as he's filming, as long as he's documenting, he can maintain the psychological distance between witness and victim, between journalist and casualty. But here's what Miles doesn't understand yet. What none of us understand until we're already trapped inside it. There are some things that destroy you whether you experience them directly or watch them through a lens. There are horrors that don't care about psychological distance, that seep through whatever barriers you construct, that reshape you simply by being witnessed. And Mount Massive Asylum is full of exactly those horrors. the decision to break in rather than involve authorities, reveals Miles's relationship with institutional power. He doesn't trust systems to police themselves. He doesn't believe reporting allegations to the government that may have funded the experiments will result in accountability. He has the cynicism common to investigative journalists who've seen too many stories of corruption without consequence, too many powerful people protected by lawyers and PR, and the sheer inertia of institutions that prioritize self-preservation over justice. So he goes alone. He becomes investigator, witness, and prosecutor all at once, gathering evidence for a trial that will occur in the court of public opinion rather than any legal venue. This lone wolf approach eliminates oversight and backup, removes anyone who might say, "This is too dangerous," or "We need to stop," transforms investigation into a solitary mission where the only person deciding how far to go is someone whose entire identity is built around not stopping. Cynicism runs through every note Miles writes throughout his ordeal. He calls Murkoff executives corporate vultures. He describes Mount Massive as a monument to evil disguised as charity. He sees through the facility's therapeutic veneer immediately, recognizes the asylum as laboratory before he's seen any direct evidence of experimentation. This cynicism is both an asset and liability. It makes him perceptive, hard to manipulate, resistant to the gaslighting that might make other people question what they're seeing. But it also isolates him, makes him unable to trust potential allies, and leaves him navigating hell without the collaboration that might have created escape routes. Dark humor emerges immediately in his written observations. Facing a locked door, he jokes grimly about his breaking and entering skills. Discovering corpses, he makes bitter quips about Murkoff's employee retention policies. This humor isn't callousness. It's a coping mechanism, a way of metabolizing horror into something that can be processed without breaking down. Trauma therapists recognize gallows humor as one of the ways people in impossible situations maintain functionality. You joke because the alternative is screaming, because laughter creates distance, because finding absurdity in a nightmare makes the nightmare slightly more bearable. But humor has limits. There are things coming that no amount of cynicism or dark jokes will protect against, violations so profound, they'll strip away every defense Miles has carefully constructed over years of chasing dangerous stories. The journalist who walks into Mount Massive Asylum is a whole person with defenses and coping strategies and a sense of purpose. The man who emerges, if emergence is even the right word for what happens, will be something fundamentally different. Miles doesn't know this yet. Standing outside the asylum, camera charged and ready, he still believes this story will follow familiar patterns. He'll gather evidence, escape, publish his findings, watch Murkoff's empire crumble under public scrutiny. He'll be scared, probably injured, definitely traumatized, but ultimately triumphant in that way investigative journalists fantasize about, the righteous victor exposing evil and holding power accountable. He's wrong about all of it. Mount Massive isn't that kind of story. Miles is about to discover that some truths extract pieces of your soul as payment for witnessing them, and that the thing you build your entire identity around can become the cage that traps you when everything else has fallen away. Chapter 2. The Camera as Psychological Shield. The first corpse Miles encounters is sprawled near the entrance, a security guard or staff member torn apart with violence that suggests rage rather than calculated killing. The cause of death is instantly, viscerally obvious. This wasn't an accident or medical emergency. Someone or something killed this person with extreme force. Miles's response is immediate and instinctive. He raises his camera, frames the corpse in night vision, and begins documenting. His written note is clinical, detached, focused on the implications for his investigation rather than the horror of what he's seeing. A person is dead in front of him, murdered recently enough that whoever did it might still be nearby, and Miles's primary response is to record evidence. This reaction tells us something essential about how Miles's mind operates under stress. Most people encountering a corpse would experience visceral horror, fear, immediate flight response, urging them to get away from danger. Miles experiences those things. We know he does because his breathing quickens. His notes mention the smell. He's clearly processing the sensory reality of death. But he channels all of that reaction through his professional identity. He's a journalist, therefore he documents. The camera becomes the lens not just for recording but for processing, transforming raw horror into data that can be handled. Psychologists call this intellectualization, a defense mechanism where emotional content gets translated into abstract or analytical thinking to make it more manageable. Instead of feeling, "I'm terrified and need to run," Miles thinks, "This evidence suggests facility-wide breakdown of security protocols." The intellectual framing creates distance, allowing him to continue functioning despite circumstances that would paralyze most people. The camcorder's night vision capability takes on significance beyond mere functionality. Mount Massive is dark, deliberately so, with power failing and lights extinguished throughout most sections. Navigating requires the camera's infrared illumination, which bathes everything in an eerie green glow that flattens depth perception and makes environments feel even less real. This visual filter reinforces psychological distance. Miles isn't seeing the asylum directly. He's seeing it through technological mediation that makes everything slightly surreal, slightly removed from immediate visceral reality. Night vision also carries specific psychological associations. Its military technology, surveillance equipment, the visual language of tactical operations, and covert observation. Using it transforms Miles from a trespassing journalist into something closer to operative on reconnaissance missions. This mental reframing matters. Soldiers on reconnaissance have protocols, training, and frameworks for processing danger. They're supposed to observe hostile territory and gather intelligence. By unconsciously adopting that visual language and operational mindset, Miles gives himself psychological structure for an experience that otherwise defies his existing frameworks. But the camera serves another function that becomes increasingly important as the night progresses. It provides mission continuity. When everything else is chaos, when nothing makes sense and survival seems impossible, Miles can return to one simple directive: keep filming. Record everything. Get the footage out. That singular focus becomes the anchor, the one thing he can control when every other variable is deadly and unpredictable. Trauma responses typically involve one of three patterns: fight, flight, or freeze, combat, escape, or shutdown. Miles demonstrates a fourth pattern that's less commonly discussed but appears in certain personality types. Document. When facing overwhelming threat, his response is to observe and record. This pattern appears in war, photographers, human rights investigators, journalists in conflict zones, people whose professional identity has become so fused with documentation that bearing witness becomes reflexive even in moments of extreme danger. Meeting Chris Walker within minutes of entering creates immediate test of Miles's psychological defenses. Walker is massive, powerful, clearly dangerous, and he grabs Miles with casual ease before hurling him through a window. The fall should be fatal, or at least incapacitating. Miles survives through luck and perhaps some of that athletic ability the game notes, landing in ways that break bones but don't kill. And his response, after regaining consciousness, is characteristically immediate. Check for the camera, make sure the equipment survived. Continue documentation. Any rational risk assessment at this point would conclude the investigation is over. Miles has confirmation that the facility houses violent individuals, He's been directly attacked, he's injured, and he's now trapped inside with no clear exit. Every survival instinct should be screaming to find a way out and abandon the mission. Instead, Miles continues forward. This isn't bravery in any traditional sense. This is someone whose psychological framework makes abandoning the investigation genuinely more distressing than facing continued danger. Father Martin's appearance introduces a new psychological dimension. Martin isn't trying to kill Miles. He's trying to recruit him. He calls Miles an apostle, chosen to witness and spread the gospel of the Wall Rider. For Martin, Miles's camera makes him perfect for this role. He's already a documentarian, already someone who understands the importance of testimony. Martin just wants to redirect that documentation toward what he sees as divine revelation rather than corporate crime. Miles recognizes Martin's delusion, but also understands that Martin's belief provides temporary protection. As long as Martin thinks Miles is fulfilling some prophetic role, he has reason to keep Miles alive and relatively safe. This calculation, cooperating with a dangerous, delusional individual because non-cooperation is more immediately lethal, demonstrates Miles's pragmatic adaptation to impossible circumstances. His cynicism becomes an asset here. He doesn't waste energy trying to reason with Martin or convince him of objective reality. He simply navigates the situation as it exists, understanding that survival sometimes means playing along with other people's psychosis. The attempt to escape via the security controls shows Miles's problem-solving under pressure. Locked inside a hostile environment, he identifies potential exit routes and works methodically to achieve it despite obstacles. Restarting generators, navigating dangerous areas, completing tasks while being hunted, all of this demonstrates high cognitive flexibility, ability to maintain goal-directed behavior even when terrified. This cognitive flexibility is part of what makes Miles an effective investigative journalist. He can hold multiple variables in mind simultaneously, adapt plans when circumstances change, and maintain focus on objectives despite distractions. But this same flexibility creates vulnerability. People who can adapt rapidly to changing circumstances sometimes adapt to things they shouldn't, normalizing situations that should trigger absolute rejection. Miles is being hunted through an asylum by violent patients, discovering evidence of horrific experimentation, witnessing systematic human rights violations, and his mind keeps adapting. It keeps finding ways to function, to continue the mission, to document the next thing. What should provoke complete psychological collapse instead gets metabolized into the mission framework, filed away as more evidence to eventually report. This is where the camera starts becoming less a protective tool and more a psychological trap. As long as Miles can keep filming, his mind interprets the situation as manageable. The documentation provides an illusion of control, suggesting that he's still a journalist working on a story rather than a victim trapped in a nightmare. But that illusion prevents appropriate threat response, keeps him pushing forward into escalating danger because the framework of investigative mission doesn't include stopping. Father Martin's sedation and imprisonment of Miles in the prison block creates the first major disruption of Miles's psychological defenses. He loses consciousness, loses time, wakes in a location he didn't choose with no memory of how he got there. This loss of continuity, this gap in the documentation record, represents violation of the framework keeping him functional. For the first time, something has happened that he didn't witness, didn't record, can't account for. The camera failed to protect him. Waking in a cell with "Rest in Peace" written on the wall in blood would break most people's remaining grip on reality. It's theatrical cruelty, a message that could mean Miles is meant to die here, or has symbolically already died, or is being mocked by someone who understands exactly how trapped he is. Miles's response shows his defenses straining. His note about this moment carries more emotional weight than his earlier observations, more acknowledgement of fear and desperation. The intellectual distance is narrowing. The twins discussing whether to kill him and harvest his organs introduces horror of being reduced to object, to a resource that other people can utilize without consent. Miles isn't a person to them. He's potential meat, potential trophies, something to be used. This objectification attacks the sense of self in ways physical threat alone doesn't. It's one thing to be prey that might be caught and killed. It's another thing entirely to be regarded as raw material, as components that predators might collect. Father Martin's protection prevents the twins from acting, which reinforces Miles's temporary alliance with delusion. Martin's psychosis is actively keeping him alive, creating a perverse situation where the journalist must hope the delusional cult leader continues seeing him as religiously significant. This dependence on irrational protection from irrational threat begins eroding Miles's sense of having any agency. He's not navigating the asylum through skill or planning. He's surviving through accidents of other people's madness, through coincidences that might evaporate at any moment. Moving through the prison block and into the sewers marks physical descent that mirrors what is happening to his mind. The environment keeps getting worse, more claustrophobic, more disgusting, more obviously divorced from any regulatory oversight or human dignity. And Miles keeps documenting. His notes continue. His camera keeps rolling. The mission persists even as the person carrying it out begins to fracture. The sewers require draining water to progress, which means actively manipulating the environment, solving environmental puzzles while being hunted. This combination of immediate physical threat and cognitive challenge creates a specific type of stress. Miles can't just run and hide. He has to think, plan, execute tasks requiring focus while his nervous system screams that he's in danger. This bifurcation of attention, trying to be both hunted animal and problem-solving human simultaneously, accelerates psychological exhaustion. Trauma accumulates through repetition more than intensity. A single horrific event might be processed and integrated over time, but repeated exposure, especially when each exposure prevents processing the previous one, creates cumulative damage that overwhelms the mind's capacity to heal. Miles is experiencing escalating trauma with zero opportunity for recovery. Each new horror crashes into the last, and the only coping mechanism available: keep filming, keep documenting, keep treating this as a professional assignment, is beginning to crack under the weight of what it's being asked to contain. Emerging from the sewers into the male ward should feel like progress, movement toward potential escape, or at least a more familiar environment. Instead, Miles is immediately chased by patients, forced into desperate flight, and while escaping one threat, he encounters the next. Richard Traeger represents a categorical shift in the type of threat Miles faces. The variants he's encountered so far are violent, dangerous, often delusional, but they're also patients. They're victims of Mount Massive's experiments, people damaged by the same institutional evil Miles came to expose. Traeger is different. He was Murkoff corporate, someone complicit in creating this nightmare, and he's carried his corporate sadism into the asylum's collapse. He has power, resources, controlled environment, and specific plans for what he wants to do to Miles. When Traeger ambushes and captures him, Miles loses the one thing that's been preserving his psychological integrity. He loses control of the camera. For the first time since entering Mount Massive, he can't document what's happening to him. He's strapped to a wheelchair, helpless, and about to experience torture without the protective mediation of recording it. This is where everything changes. This is where the camera as shield fails completely, and Miles has to endure trauma directly. Without buffer, without distance, without the psychological framework that's been keeping him functional. And what comes next will cost him more than fingers. It will cost him the illusion that documentation provides protection, the belief that bearing witness matters more than surviving, and the last pieces of the identity he carried into this nightmare. But we're not there yet. First, we need to understand exactly what Richard Traeger sees when he looks at Miles. What makes a corporate psychopath decide this particular victim deserves special attention, and how the torture about to unfold represents the asylum's cruelty distilled into its purest form. Pain inflicted by someone who enjoys the infliction. Suffering caused not by madness, but by choice. Chapter 3. When documentation becomes impossible. Richard Traeger's office space in the administration block maintains an eerie professionalism. The walls are clean, the equipment is organized. He's set up what he calls a therapeutic environment, complete with recording devices, surgical instruments laid out with medical precision, and a wheelchair modified to restrain whoever sits in it. When he wheels Miles into this space, speaking in that friendly corporate tone about how he's going to help, the dissonance between his words and his intentions creates immediate psychological assault. Traeger calls Miles buddy, uses the language of assistance and care, positions himself as someone providing a service. This verbal framing, while preparing instruments of torture, represents gaslighting in its most distilled form. He's telling Miles that reality is something other than what Miles can clearly perceive, forcing him to hold two contradictory understandings simultaneously. The words, "say help," the context screams harm. Miles can't reach his camera. His hands are strapped down. For the first time since entering Mount Massive, he's experiencing horror without the ability to document it, without the psychological buffer that's kept him functional through impossible circumstances. The loss of that coping mechanism means facing Traeger's torture directly, processing the experience without mediation, enduring rather than witnessing. Traeger's sadism has corporate efficiency embedded in it. He's not impulsive or chaotic. He explains what he's doing, maintains professional demeanor, treats the torture as procedure rather than violence. This calculated cruelty is more psychologically damaging than a rage-fueled attack would be. Rage implies loss of control, heat-of-moment violence that might end when emotion passes. Traeger's cold methodology communicates something worse. This is planned, purposeful, something he's choosing to do because he enjoys it. The build-up to the amputation includes Traeger filming Miles, which creates terrible irony. Miles came to Mount Massive to document others' suffering, to expose institutional cruelty through evidence gathering. Now he's the subject being documented, his pain being recorded for someone else's purposes. The reversal transforms him from witness to victim, from agent with mission to object of someone else's agenda. When Traeger removes Miles's fingers with bone shears, the physical pain is catastrophic, but the psychological damage runs deeper. Hands represent agency, capability, the ability to manipulate the world and accomplish tasks. Losing fingers isn't just losing body parts. It's losing functional capacity, becoming diminished, being forcibly made less than whole. For Miles specifically, someone whose identity centers on investigation and documentation, having his hands mutilated attacks the core of who he is. The amputation also represents a point of no return. Before this moment, Miles could, theoretically, escape Mount Massive psychologically intact, traumatized certainly but whole. Now he carries permanent physical evidence of what happened here. Scars that will never allow him to forget, disability that will impact every future action. The asylum has marked him, claiming pieces of his body as trophies, ensuring he can never fully escape even if he makes it outside the walls. Traeger's death, crushed in a closing door while pursuing Miles, happens too quickly to provide satisfaction or closure. Miles doesn't defeat him through skill or planning. Traeger dies in an accident, environmental hazard activating at precisely the right moment. This randomness reinforces Miles's complete lack of control. He's not surviving through competence. He's surviving through chance, through coincidences, and luck that might run out at any moment. Recovering his camera after escaping Traeger should feel like reclaiming agency, getting back the tool that's defined his mission. Instead, the camera now serves as a reminder of what he's lost. Operating it with mutilated hands causes pain. Every time he frames a shot, he's confronted with physical evidence of his violation. The tool that protected his psychology has become an object that highlights his trauma. But Miles keeps filming. Despite the pain, despite the trauma, despite every reason to abandon the mission and focus purely on survival, he continues documenting. This persistence reveals the depth of his psychological investment in the journalist identity, even when that identity has led directly to torture, even when continuing serves no rational purpose since he has more than enough evidence already. He can't stop. The documentation has transcended rational mission and become compulsion, the only framework his mind has left for making sense of the senselessness. His notes after the Traeger encounter show a subtle shift in tone. Earlier observations maintained clinical distance, analytical framing that kept emotion contained. Now personal horror bleeds through. The intellectual defenses are failing, unable to fully process or contain what he's experiencing. Miles is still trying to function as a journalist, but the person doing the journalism has been fundamentally damaged by what he's witnessed and endured. The encounter with the Walrider provides first direct evidence of the supernatural or technological anomaly at the facility's center. Miles sees the entity kill a patient, witnesses death caused by something that doesn't follow physical rules he understands. This experience should shatter his remaining grip on reality. His entire framework for understanding the world says such things can't exist, yet he's watching it happen. But instead of breaking him, the Walrider gives Miles something he desperately needs: an explanation. All the chaos, all the horror, the facility's collapse, and the patient's violence. It now has a cause. There's something actively hostile here. An entity that explains the inexplicable. Miles's mind can grasp at this understanding, file it away as the missing piece that makes the puzzle coherent. The Walrider is the story's center, the truth he came to expose. This cognitive reframing transforms Miles's mission from exposing corporate negligence to exposing something far larger. He's no longer just documenting human rights violations. He's documenting proof of impossible technology, supernatural threat, something that will reshape public understanding of what's possible. The scope of the story expands, and with that expansion comes a renewed sense of purpose. This matters even more than he initially understood. The stakes justify everything he's endured. Father Martin's increasing insistence that Miles must witness the Walrider, must understand its significance, creates a strange alliance between journalist and prophet. Both believe in the importance of testimony. In making people see truth they'd prefer to ignore. Martin's religious framework and Miles's journalistic framework are ideologically opposed, but functionally they're pursuing the same goal: making the Walrider's existence undeniable to the outside world. This convergence is psychologically seductive. Miles has felt alone in his mission, isolated in his commitment to exposure regardless of personal cost. Martin, for all his delusion, validates that commitment. He sees Miles's work as sacred and treats the documentation as gospel. The validation from even a delusional source provides comfort when Miles's confidence is fracturing, when he's questioning whether any of this suffering serves purpose. But Martin's protection comes with escalating demands. He leads Miles deeper into the asylum, toward the underground lab where the morphogenic engine created Mount Massive's horrors. The path requires descending into spaces even less maintained than the areas above, into sections where the facility's true purpose becomes undeniable. These lower levels are where patients were strapped into the engine, where consciousness was violated and minds were deliberately shattered, where institutional evil conducted its experiments without even the pretense of therapeutic intent. Moving through the underground lab forces Miles to witness the mechanism of Mount Massive's cruelty, the engine itself, the restraints that held patients in place, the control panels where technicians monitored brain activity while inducing nightmare states. All of it remains as evidence of systematic torture masquerading as research. Miles documents everything, his camera capturing proof that this wasn't an accidental tragedy or oversight failure. This was engineered suffering, calculated and funded and executed by people who made conscious choices to harm vulnerable populations for profit. The evidence gathering should feel like victory. This is why he came, what he needed to find. With this documentation, Murkoff can't claim ignorance or blame rogue employees. The infrastructure proves institutional commitment to atrocity. But Miles's emotional response is hollowing rather than triumphant, seeing the machinery that created the variants he's been fleeing, understanding that every violent patient was first a victim strapped into this device, metabolizes differently than evidence of standard corporate malfeasance. This isn't just crime. This is evil with bureaucratic approval, harm inflicted through proper channels, suffering that requires budgets and staff meetings and equipment procurement. The banality of it, the fact that this required ordinary people doing ordinary administrative work in service of extraordinary cruelty, is its own form of horror. Miles came expecting to expose bad actors. Instead, he's exposing a system where acting badly was policy, where torture was the intended outcome rather than deviation from proper procedure. The psychological weight of this understanding accumulates with the physical and emotional trauma already sustained. Miles is operating on failing reserves, pushing through exhaustion and pain and fear that would have stopped him hours ago if he hadn't built his entire identity around not stopping. Every step forward is victory of compulsion over self-preservation, commitment over sanity. Chris Walker's increasingly desperate attempts to kill Miles begin to take on different characters. Earlier, Walker seemed like a dangerous obstacle, a threat to evade. Now, having seen what the engine did to people, having understood that Walker is a veteran whose PTSD was weaponized by the same system Miles is investigating, the pursuit carries a tragic dimension. Walker isn't hunting Miles out of malice. He's trying to complete a mission his broken mind tells him is necessary, following orders that no longer exist, serving a chain of command that abandoned him. This reframing doesn't make Walker less dangerous. A sympathetic understanding of someone's trauma doesn't prevent them from killing you, but it complicates Miles's relationship to his own story. He came to create a clear narrative of victims and perpetrators, to expose wrongdoing and identify villains. Mount Massive keeps frustrating that clarity. The perpetrators are victims. The victims are perpetrators. The only clear villains are the ones who aren't here. The Murkoff executives and government officials who created this system and then walked away when it collapsed. Billy Hope's discovery introduces the Walrider's host, the patient whose consciousness merged with nanotechnology to create the entity. Billy is comatose, barely alive, his body sustained by machines while his mind operates the swarm. Seeing Billy provides the final piece of evidence Miles needs. The Walrider isn't supernatural. It's technological horror, human consciousness merged with Murkoff's experimental nanomachines into something that transcends individual biology. This revelation should be Miles's triumph. He has the full story now, complete documentation from initial allegations through experimental methodology to the ultimate creation of a weapon that could reshape warfare and social control. Everything he suffered to obtain this evidence was in service of exposing a threat that extends far beyond one facility. The Walrider represents proof that consciousness itself can be technologically manipulated, that the boundaries between human and machine are more permeable than public understanding acknowledges. That Murkoff has achieved a breakthrough that makes MK Ultra look like preliminary research. But something has shifted in Miles's psychology. The mission that sustained him through torture and terror is reaching completion, and he's discovering that completion doesn't bring relief. He's not feeling victorious or even satisfied. He's feeling empty, hollowed out, as though the purpose that held him together is dissolving now that it's nearly achieved. This emotional void is common in people who've organized their entire being around a single goal. Reaching the goal creates a crisis of meaning, sudden absence of the structure that made continued functioning possible. Miles needs to escape. He has the evidence. The story is complete. Everything from this point is about getting outside the walls and ensuring the documentation reaches people who can act on it. This should simplify his decision-making, create clear objectives with no moral ambiguity. Survive, escape, expose. Father Martin has different plans. He sets fire to the chapel, crucifying and immolating himself in an act of delusional martyrdom, destroying the path Miles was using to escape. This betrayal, because that's how it feels despite Martin's sincere belief that he's serving Miles's ultimate spiritual welfare, traps Miles in the facility at precisely the moment escape seemed possible. The psychological impact is devastating. Miles has endured everything the asylum could inflict, maintained his mission through circumstances that should have shattered him, gathered evidence comprehensive enough to destroy Murkoff, and now he's trapped anyway. The suffering served no purpose. The documentation means nothing if it remains inside Mount Massive. The mission fails, not because Miles failed, but because a delusional cult leader decided Miles needed to witness the apocalypse rather than report it. Rage would be an appropriate response. Despair would be understandable. Instead, Miles experiences something more complex, a kind of bitter acceptance. Of course, this is how it ends. Of course, the mission fails despite complete success in evidence gathering. Of course, the story matters less than he believed. His cynicism, the dark worldview that made him an effective investigator, is being validated in the worst possible way. But Miles doesn't stop. With no rational path to escape, with Martin's betrayal blocking the exit, and Walrider hunting through the facility, and Chris Walker still pursuing his delusional containment mission, Miles continues forward. He's no longer moving toward goal. He's simply moving because stopping means confronting the totality of his failure, and that confrontation would complete the psychological destruction that Mount Massive has been inflicting all night. Forward momentum is the last defense mechanism remaining. As long as he's in motion, as long as there are tasks to complete and obstacles to navigate, he doesn't have to feel the full weight of what's happened to him. The dissociation that began with the camera's psychological distance has progressed to dissociation from his own emotional reality. He's operating on autopilot, journalist protocols running on diminishing power, carrying him forward through sheer behavioral momentum when every psychological reason to continue has been exhausted. The underground lab's depths contain one final horror: the realization that there's no exit through these tunnels, no escape route that doesn't require returning to areas where Walker patrols and X pops. Hunt and the Walrider moves through walls. Miles has descended so far into Mount Massive's infrastructure that extraction requires ascending back through every layer of danger already traversed, running a gauntlet with resources depleted and injuries accumulated and hope extinguished. Some part of Miles understands that he's not leaving this facility. The mission has failed. The evidence will die with him. Murkoff will eliminate any trace of what happened here, will craft whatever narrative protects their interests, and the truth he suffered to document will evaporate like it never existed. This understanding doesn't arrive as dramatic revelation. It seeps in gradually, quiet certainty replacing desperate hope, until Miles is functioning with something closer to resignation than determination. Yet he continues documenting. The camera stays active. His notes persist. Even when the mission is lost, even when survival seems impossible, the behavioral loop remains. The actions have transcended purpose and become ritual, repetitive motion that provides structure when everything else has dissolved into chaos. This is the moment where Miles stops being a journalist pursuing a story and becomes something else entirely. A man whose identity has been stripped away, piece by piece, until only the hollow framework remains. He's not Miles, the investigative reporter, anymore. He's not even Miles, the trauma survivor fighting to escape. He's become documentation apparatus wearing human skin, a biological camera that moves through horror because the alternative is shutting down completely. And Mount Massive has one final violation to inflict, one last way to demonstrate that even when you think you've endured everything, even when you believe there's nothing left to take, institutions built on systematic cruelty always find new depths. Chapter 4. The Ultimate Violation. Military intervention arrives in helicopter gunships, professional soldiers deployed to contain whatever escaped from Mount Massive. For a brief, desperate moment, Miles must feel something like hope. Authority figures with weapons and resources and chain of command extending beyond the asylum's walls. Surely they're here to help, to rescue survivors, to secure the facility and begin investigation into what happened. That hope dies the moment they see Miles. He's not rescued, he's the designated target. The soldiers open fire immediately, treating him as a threat requiring elimination rather than a victim requiring extraction. And in that moment, Miles understands the final truth. Murkoff's reach extends into government response. Their corruption runs deep enough that the military intervention is about containment rather than accountability, about eliminating witnesses rather than gathering evidence. Everything he suffered was pointless. The documentation he gathered will never see public release. The evidence comprehensive enough to destroy Murkoff will be classified or destroyed along with his body. The mission that sustained him through torture and terror and trauma was doomed from the start, not by his failure, but by institutional power that views truth as threat requiring neutralization. Being shot creates specific trauma. Bullets tear through flesh, shatter bone, cause catastrophic damage to biological systems. But being shot by people who should represent rescue, who wear uniforms associated with protection and service, inflicts additional psychological wounds. It's not just physical violation, it's betrayal of every assumption about how legitimate authority should function, confirmation that the system itself is corrupted beyond redemption. Miles falls. He's dying. His body is shutting down from blood loss and trauma. And in his final moments, the Walrider makes its choice. The entity needs a host. Billy hopes. Body is failing, can no longer sustain the consciousness nanotechnology fusion. The Walrider has been searching for suitable replacement, someone whose mind can handle merger without immediate collapse. It chooses Miles, and everything Miles was ceases to exist. The merger isn't a metaphorical union, it's a literal invasion, nanotechnology flowing into his body, rewriting his biology at molecular level, consuming his consciousness and reconstructing it as something new. Miles doesn't become pilot of the Walrider. He becomes a component, absorbed into the entity's distributed intelligence, his identity dissolved into swarm consciousness. This final violation is absolute. Traeger took his fingers. Martin took his hope of escape. Murkoff took his mission's purpose. But the Walrider takes his self, the core identity that makes Miles who he is. Everything he suffered to preserve, his autonomy, his agency, his determination to bear witness, regardless of cost, is erased in the merger. Some fragments of Miles might remain within the Walrider. The entity demonstrates intelligence, purpose, patterns that might reflect the consciousness it absorbed. When it slaughters the soldiers who shot Miles, perhaps some echo of his rage at being betrayed drives the violence. When it prevents further attempts to contain or destroy it, perhaps his investigative instinct toward truth and exposure shapes its resistance. But Miles, the person, the freelance journalist who drove to Colorado to expose corporate evil, who maintained his mission through impossible circumstances, who traded pieces of his humanity for documentation and purpose, that man is gone. He doesn't die in any traditional sense. Death would be mercy. Instead, he's subsumed, incorporated into something that uses his biological components and perhaps fragments of his consciousness, but isn't him in any meaningful way. This ending is more horrifying than simple death. Miles enters Mount Massive as a whole person with agency, beliefs, identity, purpose. He exists as distributed intelligence, individual consciousness dissolved into swarms, autonomy replaced by merger with entities that operate according to imperatives he no longer controls. His worst fear, the loss of self, the inability to document and expose truth, becoming object rather than agent, is realized completely. Epilogue shows Wayland Park, the whistleblower who sent the original email that brought Miles to Mount Massive. Escaping in the chaos, Wayland survives. Wayland gets out. Wayland will presumably attempt to expose what happened, continuing the mission Miles died trying to complete. This parallel narrative emphasizes the arbitrary cruelty of Miles's fate. Both men pursued the same goal with similar determination. One escapes to tell the story, the other becomes part of the horror he tried to expose. There's no justice in this ending, no redemption or moral resolution. Miles doesn't defeat Murkoff or expose their crimes to consequences. He simply ceases to exist as an individual, absorbed into the weapon he tried to document, becoming the very thing he sought to reveal to the world. His identity, investigative journalist, truth seeker, witness to atrocity, is erased more thoroughly than death could erase it. The psychological horror of this conclusion operates on multiple levels. Surface level, it's body horror, physical transformation into something no longer human. Deeper level, it's autonomy, horror, loss of agency over your own existence. Deepest level, it's identity horror. The recognition that everything you are can be systematically dismantled and replaced until nothing recognizable remains. Chapter 5. The Psychology of Compulsive Witnessing. Understanding what happened to Miles requires stepping back from the narrative sequence and examining the psychological mechanisms at work throughout his ordeal. His story isn't just about surviving horror. It's about how certain personality structures respond to extreme trauma, how professional identity can become both shield and trap, and what happens when the thing you've built your entire sense of self around leads directly to your destruction. Let's start with the core question. What kind of person willingly walks into danger armed only with a camera and conviction? Clinical psychology recognizes a pattern called counterphobic behavior, where individuals manage anxiety by deliberately confronting the things that frighten them. Most people avoid threats. Counterphobic individuals move toward them, experiencing the approach as mastery over fear rather than submission to it. This pattern appears frequently in extreme sports, enthusiasts, combat journalists, emergency responders, people whose careers require entering situations most humans instinctively flee. Miles exhibits clear counterphobic traits. His professional history involves repeatedly pursuing stories that carry personal risk. Getting fired for controversial Afghanistan content didn't make him more cautious. It freed him from institutional constraints, allowing him to take even greater risks. The email about Mount Massive didn't trigger appropriate wariness. It triggered excitement, the sense that he'd found something important enough to justify whatever danger accompanied it. But counterphobic behavior alone doesn't explain Miles's persistence once inside the asylum. Most war photographers, despite high-risk tolerance, retreat when situations exceed their capacity to manage. They recognize the difference between calculated risk and suicidal exposure. Miles doesn't retreat. He continues forward even after rational assessment would conclude that a mission is compromised beyond salvage. This persistence suggests something deeper than counterphobic traits. It suggests what psychologists call pathological altruism, when helping behaviors become so extreme they're self-destructive. When the impulse to serve others or advance greater good overrides self-preservation to pathological degree. Pathological altruism appears in activists who destroy their health for causes, in caregivers who sacrifice their own well-being completely for those they serve, in whistleblowers who pursue exposure knowing it will cost them everything. Miles's mission carries this quality. He's not investigating Mount Massive for personal gain. Freelance journalism rarely pays enough to justify the risks he's taking. He's doing it because he believes someone must, because the victims deserve exposure of what was done to them, because institutional evil flourishes in darkness and someone needs to provide light. These are altruistic motivations elevated to such extreme that they become pathological, overriding the self-protection that should limit how much any individual sacrifices for abstract principle. The camera serves as a focal point for both counterphobic behavior and pathological altruism. By filming, Miles transforms passive fear into active documentation, converts helpless witnessing into purposeful evidence gathering. The documentation serves an altruistic goal of eventual exposure, while providing psychological structure that manages his fear. The camera is the perfect object for his particular psychological needs. It addresses anxiety through confrontation, while justifying extreme self-sacrifice through service to truth. But here's what nobody talks about when discussing Miles. His psychological structure was always fragile. The mission-focused identity, the compulsive documentation, the inability to retreat from danger, these aren't signs of exceptional strength. They're signs of someone whose sense of self is precariously organized around external purpose because internal coherence is insufficient. People with robust psychological foundations can lose jobs, abandon missions, accept failure, and remain intact because their identity isn't exclusively invested in a single domain. Their self-concept draws from multiple sources: relationships, values, interests, capabilities across various contexts. When one domain fails, others provide stability. Miles shows no evidence of this multiplicity. His apartment in D.C. presumably exists but receives no mention or description. His relationships, if any exist, are absent from the narrative. His interests beyond journalism don't appear. His entire presented identity is investigative reporter, pursuing exposure of corruption. That singular focus made him effective at his work. It also made him psychologically vulnerable in ways he never recognized. When Mount Massive attacks his ability to complete the mission, through Traeger's torture, Martin's betrayal, the military's intervention, it's not just attacking his current project. It's attacking the core structure holding his identity together. Without the mission, Miles has no clear sense of who he is or why his existence matters. This explains his continued documentation even when rational analysis says the mission is lost. Abandoning the documentation means confronting the void where a multifaceted self should exist. Acute stress disorder provides a clinical framework for understanding Miles's progression through the night. ASD occurs within 3 days to 1 month after trauma exposure and includes symptoms across multiple domains, intrusive symptoms like involuntary memories and flashbacks. Miles experiences these as recurring images of violence witnessed. Negative mood characterized by inability to experience positive emotions, His notes show progressive loss of hope or satisfaction even when achieving investigative goals. Dissociative symptoms including altered sense of reality and inability to remember aspects of traumatic experience. The camera-mediated perception creates exactly this kind of dissociative buffer. Avoidance symptoms like efforts to avoid distressing memories or external reminders. Miles shows an inverted version of this, compulsively approaching rather than avoiding, which itself is a dissociative strategy. Arousal symptoms including hypervigilance, exaggerated startle response, sleep disturbance, difficulty concentrating. Every one of these appears in Miles's behavior and physical responses. The ASD framework helps explain why Miles's defenses progressively fail. Early in the ordeal, dissociation through camera mediation effectively manages acute stress, but dissociation has limits. As trauma accumulates and intensifies, as physical injuries compound psychological wounds, the dissociative buffer degrades. Miles's later notes show this degradation. Less clinical distance, more raw emotion bleeding through, acknowledgement of fear, and desperation that earlier entries suppressed. Traeger's torture represents the breaking point for dissociative defenses. Being strapped down eliminates agency. Losing access to the camera eliminates the mediating tool. Experiencing mutilation eliminates the illusion that documentation provides protection. For the first time, Miles must endure trauma directly, without psychological buffer, and his mind lacks alternative coping mechanisms because his entire psychological toolkit was organized around that single strategy. What happens to someone when their primary defense mechanism is stripped away during ongoing trauma? Typically, one of three outcomes. Some people access secondary defenses, different coping strategies that become available when primary ones fail. Some people experience acute decompensation, a rapid collapse of psychological functioning that manifests as catatonia, psychotic break, or dissociative fugue. Some people develop what's called over-controlled coping, where they shut down emotional processing entirely and operate on a purely mechanical level, following behavioral scripts without connecting to the meaning or emotional content of their actions. Miles shows the third pattern. After Traeger, his documentation continues, but its quality changes. The observations become more mechanical, less analytical. He's going through motions of journalism without the intellectual engagement that characterized earlier work. The defense mechanism isn't protecting him anymore. It's simply running on autopilot. A behavioral loop that persists because his psychology has no other programming to replace it with. This mechanical continuation mirrors what happens in severe PTSD, where trauma survivors describe feeling like they're watching themselves from outside, following scripts of normal behavior without feeling connection to their actions. Clinicians call this depersonalization, a dissociative symptom where you experience yourself as unreal or detached from yourself. Miles is experiencing depersonalization by the time he reaches the underground lab, operating as though he's watching someone else use his body to complete a mission that no longer feels real or important. Complex trauma theory, developed originally to understand abuse survivors, provides another lens. Complex trauma occurs when someone experiences repeated, prolonged traumatic events from which escape is impossible or perceived as impossible. Unlike single-incident trauma that might be processed and integrated, complex trauma creates pervasive changes to identity, emotional regulation, and relationship patterns. Miles's night at Mount Massive qualifies as complex trauma despite its brief duration. The trauma is repeated, dozens of separate life-threatening incidents. It's prolonged, lasting hours without respite, and escape is progressively revealed as impossible. Every attempted exit is blocked. Every potential rescue becomes an additional threat until Miles is trapped, not just physically but psychologically. understanding that there's no path out that doesn't require enduring more trauma. Complex trauma survivors often develop what's called trauma bonding, where they form attachments to people or systems causing them harm because those same sources occasionally provide relief or protection. Miles's strange alliance with Father Martin demonstrates this pattern. Martin sedates and imprisons him, manipulates and ultimately betrays him. But Martin also protects him from the twins, provides structure and purpose when Miles is drowning in chaos, offers validation that the documentation matters. Miles begins depending on Martin despite recognizing his delusion, because Martin represents the only semi-reliable source of safety in an environment where everything else is unambiguously lethal. This trauma bonding doesn't mean Miles is weak or psychologically deficient. It means his nervous system, designed to identify safety and attach to protective figures, is making desperate calculations in impossible circumstances. When literally everyone is dangerous, you attach to whoever is least dangerous in the moment, even if they're still fundamentally threatening your survival. The progression from investigative journalist to trauma survivor to wall rider component represents systematic destruction of self across multiple dimensions. First, the mission loses its meaning when escape becomes impossible. Purpose is eliminated. Second, physical integrity is violated through Traeger's mutilation. Bodily autonomy is eliminated. Third, hope of rescue evaporates when military forces shoot rather than save him. External salvation is eliminated. Fourth, consciousness itself is subsumed into the wall rider. Identity is eliminated. Each stage removes another foundation of selfhood. By the end, there's nothing left that could be called Miles Upshur in any meaningful sense. He's been deconstructed completely, transformed from an autonomous agent with beliefs and goals and identity into a biological component of distributed intelligence that operates according to imperatives he no longer controls. Chapter 6: The Mission That Devours Its Disciples. Here's what people miss when analyzing Outlast's protagonist. Miles doesn't fail. He succeeds completely. He gathers comprehensive evidence of Mount Massive's atrocities. He documents the morphogenic engine, the patient abuse, the corporate conspiracy, the technological horror of the wall rider. His journalism is flawless. His investigation is thorough. His evidence would destroy Murkoff if it reached public consciousness. The mission fails not because Miles failed, but because the mission was always designed to fail. Institutions built on systematic cruelty don't survive exposure by being defeated by lone journalists. They survive by ensuring journalists like Miles disappear, their evidence classified or destroyed, their testimony eliminated along with their existence. This distinction matters psychologically. Miles spends his final conscious moments believing he failed, that his suffering was pointless, that the story dies with him. But he didn't fail at journalism. He failed to understand that journalism alone can't defeat institutional evil that's integrated into government and military power structures. His error wasn't in execution, it was in believing that truth carries inherent power, that exposure creates inevitable accountability. That belief is itself a kind of faith, a secular version of Martin's religious delusion. Martin believes the wall rider is divine, and its revelation will bring salvation. Miles believes truth is powerful, and its revelation will bring justice. Both beliefs are delusional in their own way, assuming the world operates according to principles, spiritual or rational, that reality doesn't actually honor. The parallel between Martin and Miles deserves deeper examination because it reveals something uncomfortable about investigative journalism's psychological underpinnings. Both men are true believers in systems of meaning that require converting others. Martin wants people to witness the wall rider and accept its divinity. Miles wants people to see his evidence and accept Murkoff's guilt. Both treat their missions as moral imperatives that justify extreme personal sacrifice. Both believe their work serves greater good beyond individual welfare. Where they differ is that Martin's framework is explicitly religious, while Miles's framework presents as rational and secular. But functionally, investigative journalism, as Miles practices it, has religious qualities. It requires faith that truth matters, faith that exposure creates change, faith that bearing witness is inherently valuable, even when concrete outcomes can't be guaranteed. These aren't rational calculations of cost and benefit. They're articles of faith that structure Miles's entire worldview. When that faith is revealed as insufficient, when truth doesn't create change, when exposure is prevented by institutional power, when witnessing accomplishes nothing, Miles experiences something analogous to spiritual crisis. His foundational beliefs about how the world works, about what makes suffering meaningful, are demonstrated to be false. That crisis is more psychologically devastating than the physical torture or threats to life, because it eliminates the framework that made enduring those things bearable. Learned helplessness provides additional framework for understanding Miles's psychological deterioration. Psychologist Martin Seligman's research established that when animals or humans are subjected to aversive conditions they can't escape or control, they eventually stop trying to escape even when escape becomes possible. They learn that their actions don't influence outcomes, and this learning produces profound passivity. Miles demonstrates learned helplessness progression. Early in Mount Massive, he actively seeks exit routes, plans escape attempts, takes initiative to create opportunities for survival. But as every attempt is thwarted, Father Martin drugs and redirects him. Traeger captures him. Martin's fire blocks his exit. Military forces shoot him. Miles learns that his agency is illusory. Nothing he does successfully extracts him. His efforts don't influence outcomes. Eventually, he stops genuinely trying to escape and instead just continues forward through whatever path is least immediately lethal. This isn't conscious surrender. It's neurological learning. The brain recognizing patterns and adjusting behavior based on what it's learned about the relationship between action and outcome. When actions repeatedly fail to produce desired results, the brain conserves energy by reducing future attempts. Miles keeps moving, keeps documenting, but the quality of his problem-solving degrades. He's going through motions rather than genuinely strategizing because his nervous system has learned that strategy doesn't matter. The concept of locus of control is relevant here. People with internal locus of control believe their actions influence outcomes, that they're agents shaping their own fates. People with external locus of control believe outcomes are determined by external forces beyond individual influence. Neither extreme is adaptive. The healthiest perspective recognizes that some things are within your control, and some aren't. Miles enters Mount Massive with a strong internal locus of control. He's an investigative journalist, someone whose entire profession assumes individual agency can create change. His decision to investigate reflects belief that his actions matter, that what he chooses to do will influence outcomes beyond himself. Mount Massive systematically destroys that internal locus of control. Every attempt to influence his circumstances is thwarted by forces he can't predict or manage. Variants appear unpredictably. Safe routes become blocked. Allies like Martin become obstacles. Apparent rescue becomes assassination attempt. The facility teaches him, through brutal repetition, that external forces determine outcomes, regardless of his choices. By the end, Miles has a fully external locus of control. He's not making decisions so much as reacting to circumstances, allowing the environment to determine his actions rather than asserting agency. The Walrider's final merger is an almost inevitable conclusion to this progression. Complete absorption into external force. Individual agency eliminated entirely. Chapter 7: Autonomy, Identity, and the Horror of Erasure. The Walrider merger represents ultimate violation not because it's painful, though the experience likely is, but because it eliminates the boundary between self and other. Bodily autonomy is a foundational human need, the requirement that your body remain under your control, that violations of your physical boundaries require your consent. When autonomy is violated through assault, through restraint, through medical procedures performed without consent, the psychological damage often exceeds physical harm because the violation attacks your sense of being a coherent self with rights over your own existence. Miles experienced progressive loss of bodily autonomy throughout his ordeal. Traeger straps him down and mutilates him, violation of autonomy through forced body modification. Military forces shoot him, violation of autonomy through assault that his body can't resist. The Walrider enters and subsumes him, violation of autonomy so complete it eliminates the boundary between Miles's biology and external intelligence. But the horror goes deeper than bodily autonomy. It's ontological violation, an attack on the fundamental existence of selfhood. Philosophers distinguish between having a body and being a body. Most contemporary understanding suggests we are our bodies, that consciousness emerges from physical brain processes, that there's no separate soul or self that could exist independently of biological substrate. If we are our bodies, then what happens when those bodies are invaded and transformed at molecular level? When nanotechnology reconstructs your biology while consciousness persists during the transition? The Walrider merger doesn't just violate Miles's autonomy, it questions whether Miles continues to exist as a coherent entity or whether something new has been created that contains fragments of what Miles was but isn't Miles in any continuous sense. This is different from death. Death is ending, cessation of existence, but at least it leaves identity intact up to the moment of cessation. You die as yourself. The Walrider merger is transformation, continuation of some kind of existence that isn't you anymore. Identity dissolved into something that uses your components but doesn't preserve your continuity. Science fiction and philosophy have explored these questions through thought experiments like the ship of Theseus. If you gradually replace every component of a ship, is it still the same ship? If you upload consciousness to a computer, destroying the original brain in the process, is the upload you or a copy of you? The Walrider merger forces these abstract questions into a horror framework, demonstrating what it might feel like to experience identity dissolution. Some fragments of Miles might persist within the Walrider's distributed consciousness. The entity demonstrates intentionality, targeting specific threats, protecting itself strategically, showing signs of purpose that might reflect absorbed human consciousness. But intention isn't identity. An AI trained on someone's writings might reproduce their communication patterns without being them. The Walrider containing patterns derived from Miles's consciousness doesn't mean Miles exists within it, any more than your deleted internet history. Existing on server backups means you exist on those servers. The horror of erasure that Miles experiences is more profound than simple death, because it's ambiguous erasure. There's no body to bury, no clear moment of cessation. Something continues that incorporates what he was, but whether that continuation constitutes survival or whether it's something wearing his components like costume remains unknowable. He's simultaneously destroyed and preserved, eliminated and continued, creating existential uncertainty worse than certain death. Real-world parallels exist in severe dementia, where the person's body continues existing but their personality, memories, and identity progressively disappear. Families describe the horror of watching someone they love stop being that person while still being alive, creating grief without closure, loss without ending. Miles's transformation mirrors this horror, accelerated into a single moment rather than gradual decline, but carrying the same awful ambiguity about whether the person survived in any meaningful sense. Autonomy violations in healthcare contexts help illuminate why the Walrider merger is so psychologically devastating, even compared to other Mount Massive horrors. Medical ethics emphasizes informed consent precisely because procedures performed on your body without your understanding and agreement, even beneficial procedures, constitute violations. The requirement of consent acknowledges that bodily autonomy matters more than outcomes, that having things done to you without agreement is harmful regardless of whether the things themselves are helpful. The Walrider doesn't ask consent. It needs a host, identifies Miles as a suitable candidate, and executes the merger as a survival strategy. From the entity's perspective, this might even be mutually beneficial. Miles is dying from gunshot wounds. The merger potentially preserves some aspect of his existence while providing the Walrider with a needed host. But benefit doesn't eliminate violation. Being transformed without consent, having your biological and neurological structure fundamentally altered by external intelligence acting on its own imperatives, is violation regardless of whether some continuation of existence results. This connects to broader themes about institutional power and bodily autonomy. Murkoff Corporation treated psychiatric patients as resources for experimentation, violated their autonomy systematically, and justified those violations through frameworks of corporate benefit and national security. The patients didn't consent to becoming test subjects. Their vulnerabilities were exploited by institutions that viewed their autonomy as irrelevant compared to research objectives. The Walrider, created through those systematic violations, ultimately perpetuates the same pattern. It violates Miles's autonomy because it needs him, because his usefulness to its survival outweighs his right to refuse. The horror Miles came to document, institutional power treating human autonomy as negotiable, becomes the horror that consumes him. He's destroyed by the very thing he sought to expose, not through ironic coincidence, but through direct causation. Murkoff created the Walrider. The Walrider needs hosts. Miles's investigation brings him into proximity where he becomes an available host. His destruction is absolutely pointless and absolutely inevitable once he chose to investigate. The mission guaranteed the outcome, not because investigation requires becoming Walrider host, but because investigating institutions powerful enough to create such things means confronting forces that view individual journalists as obstacles to eliminate. Chapter 8. What Mount Massive Reveals About Horror. Mount Massive Asylum represents a specific category of horror that deserves examination, institutional horror, where the source of terror isn't individual monster or supernatural force, but the system itself. The asylum is horrifying, not just because violent variants stalk its corridors, but because those variants are products of institutional cruelty, because the violence is a consequence of deliberate corporate choices, because the horror could only exist through systematic, organized effort. Individual monsters can be defeated, avoided, or endured. Institutional monsters are nearly impossible to resist because they're not single entities, but distributed systems. You can kill Chris Walker, but killing him doesn't address the forces that created him or prevent future Chris Walkers from being created. You can expose Murkoff's crimes, but exposure doesn't guarantee accountability when the institution has integrated into power structures that protect it. Miles's failure, and it is failure despite his successful investigation, demonstrates institutional horror's defining characteristic. Individuals can't defeat systems through individual action. His journalism, his evidence gathering, his documentation, all of it is insufficient because Murkoff isn't vulnerable to exposure. They have resources to classify information, eliminate witnesses, and continue operations under different names or in different locations. The institution survives regardless of individual investigators' efforts. This creates particular despair that pure survival horror doesn't generate. When you're hunted by an individual predator, survival represents victory. Escape means you've defeated the threat. But when you're targeted by an institution, survival is just delaying inevitable. The institution has patience, resources, and persistence that individual humans can't match. Even if Miles had escaped with his evidence intact, Murkoff would have deployed lawyers, PR firms, congressional allies, and if necessary, more direct elimination methods. The documentation might have caused temporary difficulty, but institutional survival is nearly guaranteed. Understanding this transforms how we interpret Miles's ending. The Walrider merger isn't a tragic twist, it's a logical conclusion. Miles was never going to defeat Murkoff through investigation. The best possible outcome was exposing them at the cost of his own destruction. The worst outcome was failing to expose them while still being destroyed. He got the worst outcome, but even the best outcome would have cost him everything. Institutional horror ensures that challenging the institution means being consumed by it. Real-world parallels to Mount Massive aren't difficult to find. MK Ultra actually happened. Government-sanctioned psychological torture, conducted on unwitting subjects for decades. Tuskegee experiments happen. Medical researchers deliberately withholding treatment to study disease progression. CIA black sites happened. Detention and torture facilities operating outside legal oversight. Mount Massive is fiction, but the institutional patterns it represents are documentary truth. What makes Mount Massive effective horror isn't that it shows impossible evil. It's that it shows barely exaggerated reality. Remove the supernatural elements, the Walrider, the morphogenic engine's impossible technology, and you're left with a psychiatric facility conducting unethical experiments on vulnerable populations with government funding and corporate profit motive. That's not fantasy. That's a pattern repeated throughout modern history. Miles's compulsive documentation reflects desperate hope that exposure creates accountability, that making atrocities visible will generate moral response sufficient to stop them. This hope is historically dubious. We've had extensive documentation of institutional evil, photographs from concentration camps, footage from My Lai, testimony from torture victims, leaked documents proving systematic deception, and institutions persist. Documentation creates temporary scandal, maybe some policy adjustments, but the fundamental structures that enable systematic cruelty continue operating. This isn't an argument against investigative journalism or documentation. It's acknowledgement that documentation alone is insufficient. Miles needed more than evidence. He needed power structures willing to act on evidence, public willing to maintain attention beyond initial outrage, and legal systems capable of holding corporations and government agencies accountable. He had none of those, which meant his evidence, however comprehensive, was always going to be inadequate for the task he'd assigned it. The psychiatric patients turned variants at Mount Massive are themselves victims of institutional horror who've been transformed into immediate threats that obscure the true source of danger. Chris Walker attackings. Miles is a direct, visible threat that demands immediate response. Murkoff executives approving budgets for unethical experiments are a distant, abstract threat that generates no immediate survival pressure. The system creates visible, proximate threats. The violent patients that distract from distant systemic threats. The corporate and government officials who authorize this. This is how institutional horror operates in reality. Police violence becomes a story about bad individual officers rather than systemic problems. Corporate environmental damage becomes a story about a specific factory rather than regulatory capture. Military atrocities become stories about rogue soldiers rather than command decisions. The institution survives by ensuring that attention focuses on individuals whose behavior can be dismissed as aberrant rather than on systemic patterns that reveal institutional pathology. Miles enters Mount Massive looking for evidence of Murkoff's crimes. He finds that evidence, but he also finds himself trapped in an environment where immediate survival requires focusing on variance rather than documentation, on Chris Walker and Eddie Gluskin and Richard Traeger rather than on the Murkoff executives who created the conditions that produced them. The institution protects itself by creating immediate crises that override sustained analysis of root causes. Even if Miles had escaped and published everything, the likely public response would focus on the shocking details, the violent patients, the bizarre experiments, the technological horror of the Walrider, rather than on the boring institutional mechanisms that made it possible. Congressional hearings would investigate specific Mount Massive incidents, while ignoring the broader patterns of corporate government collaboration in unethical research. Some individuals might face consequences while the system continues unchanged. This is the real horror that Miles never fully understands. His mission was doomed not because he failed at it, but because missions like his can't succeed within existing power structures. Investigative journalists can create temporary embarrassment for powerful institutions. They can't dismantle those institutions. The system is designed to absorb criticism, to survive exposure, to continue operating with minor adjustments that create the appearance of accountability without threatening fundamental structures. But here's what makes Miles's story matter despite his failure. Bearing witness has value, independent of whether it creates immediate change. His documentation, even if never seen by the public, represents refusal to let atrocity occur unrecorded. The act of witnessing, of refusing to look away, of maintaining human connection to truth even when truth is unbearable, that has inherent worth even when it doesn't generate policy outcomes. This is an uncomfortable conclusion because it means accepting that sometimes doing the right thing costs everything and accomplishes nothing tangible. Miles sacrifices his physical integrity, his psychological wholeness, his autonomy, and his life for documentation that never reaches its intended audience. From a utilitarian perspective, his sacrifice was pointless. From the perspective that values bearing witness as a moral act independent of consequences, his sacrifice has meaning even in failure. The question becomes whether that meaning is sufficient, whether the moral value of witnessing justifies the cost Miles pays. Different philosophical frameworks provide different answers. Consequentialist ethics would say no. If the action produces no beneficial consequences, the suffering isn't justified. Deontological ethics might say yes. If bearing witness is moral duty, fulfilling that duty has value regardless of outcomes. Virtue ethics would examine whether Miles's actions reflect good character, whether his investigative compulsion represents virtue, like courage and integrity, or vice, like reckless self-destruction. There's no objective answer because the question itself is about values, about what we believe gives human action meaning when material outcomes are absent or negative. Miles believed documentation mattered enough to die for. Whether that belief was wisdom or delusion, virtue or pathology, depends on frameworks we bring to evaluating it. What's clear is that Mount Massive Asylum represents institutional horror at its most comprehensive. Not just a facility where bad things happen, but a complete system designed to produce bad things, protected by power structures that ensure accountability is nearly impossible, creating visible, immediate threats that obscure systemic causes. And Miles Upshur represents the individual who challenges that system armed only with camera and conviction, achieving everything possible within his limited power, and discovering that everything possible wasn't nearly enough. Chapter 9. The Architecture of Identity Collapse. There's a concept in trauma psychology that doesn't get discussed enough outside clinical contexts: shattered assumptions theory. Psychologist Ronnie Janoff Bowman developed this framework to explain why certain traumatic experiences cause such profound psychological damage. The theory posits that we all operate with core assumptions about the world. The world is benevolent, the world is meaningful, the self is worthy. These assumptions aren't conscious beliefs we've reasoned our way toward. They're foundational orientations that structure how we interpret experiences and navigate reality. Trauma shatters these assumptions. When something happens that contradicts your fundamental beliefs about how the world works, your entire psychological framework collapses. You don't just feel upset or frightened, you lose your orienting principles, the basic convictions that made existence coherent. Miles entered Mount Massive with specific assumptions intact. The world is meaningful enough that investigating corruption serves purpose. The self is worthy enough that his documentation matters, that his work has value. Justice exists somewhere in the system, however imperfectly, and exposing truth activates that justice. These assumptions structured his entire identity as investigative journalist, gave his professional choices meaning, made his sacrifices feel justified. Mount Massive systematically demolished every assumption. The world isn't meaningful. It's arbitrary and cruel, where suffering produces no growth and sacrifice guarantees no redemption. The self isn't worthy. Miles is just meat, body parts that can be mutilated, consciousness that can be subsumed, an individual whose existence matters to absolutely no one, with power to protect him. Justice doesn't exist. The institution he's trying to expose has already captured the mechanisms that should hold it accountable, ensuring that evidence produces no consequences. Each demolished assumption removes load-bearing structure from Miles's psychological architecture. His identity as a journalist becomes incoherent when journalism accomplishes nothing. His sense of purpose evaporates when purpose leads only to destruction. His belief in his own significance dissolves when he discovers that institutions view him as an obstacle requiring elimination rather than voice deserving hearing. By the time the wall rider merges with him, there's barely anything left to destroy. The psychological demolition preceded the ontological dissolution. Miles stopped being coherent before he stopped being human, identity collapsing under weight of shattered assumptions until only behavioral remnants persisted. Documentation continuing not because it serves purpose, but because the programming runs even when the operator has mentally vacated. This progression mirrors what happens in severe complex trauma, where prolonged exposure to inescapable threat creates personality changes that persist long after threat ends. Trauma survivors describe feeling like different people after their ordeals, like something essential was lost that can never be recovered. They're not being metaphorical. The self that existed before trauma was organized around assumptions that trauma shattered. The self that exists afterward must be reconstructed on different foundations, and that reconstruction creates discontinuity of identity so profound it feels like the original person died, even though the body survived. Miles doesn't get an opportunity for reconstruction. The identity collapse happens too rapidly, without any recovery period between successive demolitions. Each shattered assumption is followed immediately by new trauma that prevents integration or adjustment. His psychological system goes into cascading failure. Each component's collapse, stressing other components until the whole structure is compromised. Attachment theory provides another lens for understanding Miles's deterioration. Human beings are wired to seek safety in connection with others, to form attachments that provide security and regulate emotional states. When threatened, we instinctively seek proximity to attachment figures who can offer protection. This isn't weakness, it's a biological imperative. survival strategy that worked for millennia because humans are social creatures whose individual vulnerability is offset by collective strength. Miles enters Mount Massive without accessible attachment figures. He's alone by choice, operating as a solitary investigator without backup or support. This isolation is simultaneously his professional strength. No one can stop him or moderate his risk-taking, and his psychological vulnerability. When threat escalates beyond his capacity to manage alone, he has no one to turn to, no attachment figure who can provide co-regulation of his overwhelmed nervous system. The absence of safe attachment creates specific psychological consequences. Without external regulation, Miles's autonomic nervous system gets stuck in hyperarousal, constantly activated threat response that depletes resources and impairs higher cognitive functions. His decision-making degrades not because he's inherently poor at decisions, but because chronic hyperarousal without opportunities for co-regulation literally impairs the prefrontal cortex regions responsible for executive function. Father Martin becomes a substitute attachment figure precisely because Miles is desperate for any relationship that provides structure and reduces uncertainty. Martin is dangerous, delusional, actively harmful to Miles's objectives, but he's also the only person in Mount Massive who talks to Miles like he's human rather than target, who offers explanations rather than just violence, who provides predictability in an environment defined by chaos. Miles's nervous system, desperate for regulation, latches on to Martin despite conscious awareness that Martin isn't safe. This attachment is trauma bonding in real time, nervous system override of rational assessment because the need for connection and regulation is more fundamental than the need for safety from specific threat. Hostages develop attachments to captors. Abuse victims stay with abusers. Not because they're weak or foolish, but because the human nervous system prioritizes having some relationship over having no relationship when completely isolated in a threatening environment. When Martin ultimately betrays Miles, setting the fire that traps him, the loss isn't just tactical, it's loss of the only quasi-attachment figure available, confirming that even the most desperate connection was an illusion. This betrayal completes Miles's isolation, removes the last thread of the relationship that was helping regulate his overwhelmed system, and contributes to his final psychological collapse. The absence of support, the systematic destruction of his assumptions, the accumulation of trauma without recovery periods, all of this creates psychological conditions where identity dissolution becomes inevitable even before the wall rider's physical intervention. Miles stops being Miles before the merger. The nanotechnology just makes literal what was already psychologically true. Chapter 10. The Witness and the Witnessed. There's an archetype in horror and trauma narratives that Miles embodies, the witness who cannot turn away. This figure appears across cultures and genres. The person who sees atrocity and feels compelled to maintain sight, even when looking destroys them. Think of Lot's wife turning to witness Sodom's destruction despite being warned the sight would kill her. Think of war photographers documenting violence that will haunt them forever. Think of whistleblowers who know exposure will cost them everything but tell the truth anyway. The witness archetype carries deep psychological complexity because witnessing serves multiple functions simultaneously. On a surface level, witnessing produces evidence, creates records that might generate accountability or preserve memory. But psychologically, witnessing is also a form of resistance, a way of refusing to let atrocity occur unacknowledged, assertion of human presence and moral judgment in face of dehumanizing violence. Miles represents this archetype in its purest form. He witnesses, not because anyone asked him to, not because he'll be rewarded for it, but because he believes witnessing matters intrinsically. The camera is a tool, but the witnessing impulse precedes the tool. Miles would find some way to document even without a camera, because the compulsion is psychological rather than merely professional. But here's the darker aspect of the witness archetype that Miles illuminates. Witnessing creates its own trauma, distinct from directly experiencing threat. Secondary trauma or vicarious traumatization refers to psychological damage sustained by witnessing others' suffering. Therapists treating trauma survivors can develop PTSD from repeated exposure to trauma narratives. Journalists covering war zones or humanitarian disasters experience trauma from bearing witness even when not personally targeted. The act of witnessing, of maintaining psychological presence to suffering, while recording it requires specific dissociation from your own emotional responses. You must observe without reacting, document without intervening, maintain enough distance to function while remaining close enough to record accurately. This dissociative stance, necessary for effective witnessing, damages the witness by requiring them to override natural empathic responses and self-protective instincts. Miles experiences both primary trauma, things happening to him directly, and secondary trauma from witnessing things happening to others. He sees corpses, watches variants kill patients, observes evidence of systematic torture, and documents all of it. Each witnessed atrocity adds to his cumulative trauma load, even when he's not the direct victim. The camera that mediates his experience doesn't prevent vicarious traumatization. It facilitates it by keeping him engaged with material that the human psyche isn't designed to process without damage. The ethical dimensions of bearing witness complicate this further. When you witness suffering you can't prevent, what are your moral obligations? Do you document it, hoping the documentation might eventually create change? Do you abandon documentation to intervene directly, even when intervention is futile? Do you look away to preserve your own psychological integrity? Miles faces these questions implicitly throughout his ordeal. He films corpses and cannot revive them. He observes variants in pain and cannot heal them. He discovers evidence of torture and cannot stop it because it already happened. His documentation is always retrospective, always recording aftermath rather than preventing occurrence. This creates specific guilt, survivor guilt combined with witness guilt, the feeling that observing suffering without preventing it constitutes moral failure even when prevention was impossible. Trauma therapists distinguish between appropriate guilt, remorse for actual harm you caused, and inappropriate guilt, remorse for harm you couldn't prevent. Witnesses often experience inappropriate guilt, feeling responsible for suffering they witnessed despite having no causal role. Miles likely experiences this throughout Mount Massive, watching people die and feeling like his documentation is inadequate response, like he should be doing more even though more isn't possible. The compulsion to document can itself become traumatic when it overrides other responses. Miles films when he might flee, observes when he might hide, maintains witness stance when survival might require abandoning it. Each choice prioritizes documentation over self-preservation, which serves his mission but accumulates psychological cost. He's training himself to override protective instincts, reprogramming his nervous system to approach rather than flee, and this reprogramming has lasting consequences for his psychological integrity. There's almost religious quality to Miles's witness commitment, a sense of calling that transcends rational cost-benefit analysis. Religious martyrs accept suffering for faith. Miles accepts suffering for documentation, for bearing witness, for the conviction that someone must record truth, even when recording costs everything. This parallel suggests that investigative journalism, as Miles practices it, has become a secular faith, complete with willingness to sacrifice self for transcendent principle. But unlike religious martyrdom, which promises spiritual reward or eternal significance, Miles's sacrifice promises nothing beyond the documentation itself. He's not dying for salvation or paradise. He's dying for footage that may never be seen, evidence that may never produce accountability, witness that may vanish without trace. The meaninglessness of potential sacrifice makes his commitment more absolute and more tragic. He continues anyway, without guarantee of reward or redemption. Viktor Frankl's concept of meaning-making in suffering is relevant here. Frankl, concentration camp, survivor and psychiatrist, argued that humans can endure almost anything if they find meaning in it. Suffering becomes bearable when we can connect it to purpose that transcends immediate pain. Miles maintains functionality through extreme suffering by connecting each moment to a larger purpose, exposing Murkoff, protecting future victims, serving truth. The meaning structure makes unbearable suffering barely bearable, but when that meaning structure collapses, when escape becomes impossible and documentation seems futile, Miles loses the framework that made endurance possible. The suffering continues, but the meaning evaporates, leaving him experiencing pure pain without purpose. This is a psychological crisis beyond standard trauma response. Existential collapse where life itself stops making sense because the organizing principle has been eliminated. The witness who cannot turn away ultimately becomes a victim of their own compulsion. The thing that gave Miles purpose and identity, compulsive documentation of difficult truths, leads directly to his destruction. The camera that protected him psychologically marked him physically, made him visible to threats he might have avoided, kept him present to traumas he might have fled. His greatest strength was his greatest vulnerability. Professional commitment became a psychological trap. Chapter 11: Powerlessness as Horror Mechanism. Outlast's mechanical design communicates something essential about horror. Through single prohibition, Miles cannot fight. He has no weapons. He cannot defeat enemies through combat. His only options are running, hiding, and hoping threats pass. This mechanical powerlessness is often discussed as a gameplay feature, but it's also a psychological statement about the type of horror Outlast explores. Traditional survival horror includes combat, however resource-constrained. Resident Evil gives you guns even when ammunition is scarce. Silent Hill provides melee weapons even when combat is discouraged. The presence of combat options, even limited ones, provides a psychological buffer against helplessness. You're endangered but not defenseless, threatened but not powerless. Outlast eliminates that buffer. Miles is completely defenseless in terms of physical confrontation. This mechanical choice forces players to experience horror Miles. Experiences not just fear of death, but fear combined with absolute inability to prevent death through direct action. The powerlessness isn't a temporary state you overcome through character progression or weapon upgrades. It's a permanent condition that defines every enemy encounter. This design mirrors real powerlessness in ways most horror games don't. Actual victims of violence rarely have combat capability against their attackers. Psychiatric patients subjected to institutional abuse can't fight their way to freedom. Journalists investigating dangerous organizations can't shoot their way out of consequences. Real vulnerability means lacking the power to protect yourself through force, and Outlast's mechanical design makes that lack experiential rather than merely conceptual. The psychological impact of sustained powerlessness is well documented in trauma research. Learned helplessness, which we discussed earlier, occurs when organisms realize their actions don't influence outcomes. But there's a related concept called tonic immobility, freeze response that occurs when fight and flight both seem impossible. Animals faced with inescapable predators sometimes become temporarily paralyzed, a neurobiological response that might reduce injury by making them seem already dead or might simply reflect nervous system overwhelm. Humans experience tonic immobility during assaults, disasters, or extreme threats. Survivors describe being conscious and aware but unable to move or speak, frozen while trauma occurs. This freeze response is an involuntary nervous system reaction, not choice or weakness. Outlast mechanically simulates something close to this when Miles is caught. Being grabbed by Variant often means death, a brief period of helplessness before everything ends. The hiding mechanics amplify powerlessness horror. Concealing yourself under bed or inside a locker means voluntarily surrendering mobility and visibility, making yourself even more vulnerable in hopes that temporary invisibility provides protection. You're trapped in confined space, unable to see whether threat has passed, every sound suggesting possible discovery. This is vulnerability without agency, protection that requires complete passivity. Psychologically, hiding represents regression to childhood defense mechanisms. Children hide from threats they can't physically oppose, making themselves small and hoping to escape notice. An adult hiding in a life-threatening situation feels humiliating precisely because it requires abandoning adult capabilities and reverting to child logic. If I can't see them, maybe they can't see me. The shame of hiding, of being reduced to such primitive defense, compounds the fear. Miles's powerlessness extends beyond mechanical combat inability. He's also powerless to protect others, powerless to prevent Murkoff's experiments from having already occurred, powerless to ensure his documentation reaches anyone who could act on it. The powerlessness is comprehensive, affecting every domain of agency. This creates specific despair, not just fear of personal death, but awareness that nothing you do matters, that you're completely unable to influence any outcome that matters. Trauma survivors often describe loss of agency as more psychologically damaging than physical harm. Assault survivors who were paralyzed by fear or physically restrained experience particular anguish over their inability to resist, even when resistance would have been futile or increased danger. The powerlessness itself becomes trauma, separate from whatever harm occurred during the powerless period. Miles's entire ordeal is sustained, powerlessness interrupted by brief moments of limited agency. He can complete environmental puzzles, restart generators, navigate spaces, but these small agencies exist within the context of massive powerlessness. He cannot fight variants, cannot force doors open, cannot call for help, cannot leave until the institution permits it. His agency is always bound by overwhelming constraints. This mirrors how institutional power operates in reality. Individuals facing institutions have limited agency in domains the institution permits, while being utterly powerless in domains the institution controls. You might be able to file complaints or hire lawyers, but the institution controls timeframes, costs, procedures, and ultimate outcomes. Your permitted agency exists within the framework of institutional power that ensures you ultimately can't threaten the institution's survival. Powerlessness horror resonates particularly with people who've experienced institutional betrayal, medical trauma from procedures performed without adequate consent, abuse by authority figures who should have provided protection, justice system failures that compound rather than address harm. For these people, Miles's experience reflects their reality more accurately than empowered horror protagonists who can fight back. He's subjected to systematic violation by institutions that view him as an object, and he cannot fight or negotiate or escape because the institution controls all the relevant variables. The ending crystallizes this powerlessness theme. Miles is shot by military forces despite being an unarmed journalist, despite being a victim rather than threat. His powerlessness to prevent this assassination attempt, his inability to make the soldiers see him as a person deserving protection rather than a target requiring elimination, demonstrates that force utterly overwhelms individual agency, and the Walrider merger is ultimate powerlessness. His body violated, his consciousness subsumed, his identity eliminated, all without his consent or ability to resist. What makes this ending genuinely horrifying, rather than just sad, is that Miles never gains power. Most horror narratives include arc where the victim becomes an agent, where initial powerlessness is overcome through learning, through allies, through discovering inner strength. Miles's arc goes in the opposite direction. He starts with limited agency and progressively loses what little power he had until he's utterly consumed by forces he couldn't influence or resist. This inverted arc violates narrative expectations and emotional needs. We want victims to become survivors who overcome their trauma. We want witnesses to successfully expose evil. We want powerlessness to be a temporary state that gives way to empowerment. Miles's story refuses to provide that satisfaction, insisting instead that some powerlessness is absolute. Some institutions are too powerful for individuals to defeat, and some suffering produces no growth or redemption. The horror of that refusal is more uncomfortable than any jumpstart or gore effect because it challenges our core beliefs about narrative and justice. We need to believe that individuals matter, that actions have consequences, that good faith effort produces meaningful outcomes. Miles's complete failure, despite genuine heroism and comprehensive success at investigation, suggests that maybe individuals don't matter enough. Maybe actions don't guarantee consequences. Maybe effort alone is insufficient. Chapter 12. Why We Keep Watching. Here's the question that haunts anyone who's thought deeply about Miles Upshur's story. Why is this compelling? His investigation fails. His suffering produces no redemption. His identity is erased. There's no victory, no justice, no meaningful resolution. By every standard of satisfying narrative, Outlast's story should be unbearable frustration rather than engaging horror. Yet it works. People play through Miles's ordeal and feel something more complex than simple disappointment at the bleak ending. Part of the answer lies in how horror functions psychologically. We're drawn to horror not despite its depiction of terrible things, but because of it. Horror provides a safe container for exploring fears that we can't easily examine in daily life. We can experience fear, helplessness, and loss through fictional characters while maintaining our actual safety. This distance allows us to engage with psychological material that would be overwhelming if experienced directly. Miles's powerlessness specifically resonates because it reflects anxieties many people carry but rarely articulate. We live in a society where institutions, corporations, governments, healthcare systems, legal structures have power over individual lives that individuals cannot effectively challenge. Most of us never face a situation as extreme as Mount Massive, but many of us have experienced smaller versions of institutional indifference, have felt powerless against systems that view us as cases rather than people. Watching Miles confront ultimate institutional power and be destroyed by it validates the fear that our limited power might be illusory, that if we ever genuinely threaten institutional interests, we would discover how powerless we truly are. It's not comforting validation, it's disturbing one, but there's psychological relief in having fears acknowledged rather than dismissed. Horror says, yes, you're right to be afraid. Your sense of vulnerability isn't paranoia. The powerlessness you intuit is real. The witness role also creates identification points. Most people aren't action heroes capable of combat or superhuman feats, but most people can imagine themselves as a witness, as a person who sees something terrible and feels compelled to document or respond even when the response carries risk. Miles isn't special in terms of physical capabilities. He's reasonably athletic but otherwise ordinary. His distinguishing feature is his commitment to witnessing, and that commitment is relatable in ways combat prowess isn't. When Miles suffers for his commitment, we're confronting questions about our own values. Would we witness if witnessing costs this much? Should we witness even when it accomplishes nothing tangible? Is there meaning in bearing witness regardless of consequences? Or is that martyr complex masquerading as morality? These aren't comfortable questions, and Miles's story doesn't provide answers. It just holds the questions up for examination while showing one possible outcome of choosing to witness despite cost. The game's first-person perspective intensifies identification. You see through Miles's eyes, hold his camera, hear his breathing. The mechanical design forces you to make his choices, to document rather than immediately flee, to hide rather than fight, to continue forward into danger rather than give up. You're not watching Miles make these choices. You're making them yourself within the game's constraints. This creates experiential understanding that pure observation wouldn't provide. There's also something compelling about watching someone maintain integrity under conditions designed to destroy it. Miles keeps documenting when documentation becomes pointless. He maintains his professional identity when that identity serves no functional purpose. He refuses to surrender to circumstances even when surrender would be more rational than persistence. This stubborn commitment to self despite everything working to erase self has tragic nobility. We're drawn to tragedy for reasons philosophers have debated since ancient Greece. Aristotle argued, tragedy produces catharsis, purging of emotions through their dramatic expression. Watching Miles's destruction might provide an outlet for our own fears about powerlessness, might allow us to experience identity dissolution in a safe context, and thereby metabolize anxieties about losing ourselves. The safety of fiction lets us approach psychological material that would be too threatening to confront directly. Modern psychology suggests additional mechanisms. Terror management theory proposes that humans developed culture, meaning-making, and symbolic immortality as buffers against awareness of mortality. Horror fiction lets us rehearse death encounters in contexts where we survive through identification with audience position rather than character. Miles dies and is absorbed into Walrider, but we survive the experience of his death, confirming our continued existence while having faced mortality vicariously. Miles's story also provides meaning where reality often doesn't. His suffering has narrative structure, cause and effect, thematic coherence. Real suffering is often random, pointless, devoid of meaning beyond the brute fact of pain. Fictional suffering, even when it depicts meaninglessness, is crafted to communicate something. Miles's meaningless sacrifice is meaningful as a narrative statement about institutional power and individual vulnerability. The paradox of meaningful meaninglessness makes his story more bearable than equivalent real suffering would be. There's an uncomfortable possibility that we're drawn to Miles's story partially because it confirms a cynical worldview that's easier to hold than maintaining hope. If institutions are irredeemably corrupt, if individual action is futile, if effort produces no meaningful change, then we're justified in not trying, in protecting ourselves, rather than taking risks to challenge power. Miles's failure can be used as evidence that challenging power is pointless, that whistleblowers and journalists and activists are deluded martyrs whose sacrifices accomplish nothing. But that interpretation requires ignoring something essential. Miles's investigation was fundamentally correct. Murkoff was conducting unconscionable experiments. The facility was a horror factory. Everything Miles believed about institutional evil was validated by what he found. His failure to expose Murkoff doesn't mean his understanding was wrong. It means power protects itself effectively. There's a difference between being wrong and being defeated, between delusion and tragic courage. The fact that Miles fails doesn't mean investigation and exposure are worthless. It means individual investigators face overwhelming odds. that success requires more than individual heroism, that systemic problems require collective action rather than lone heroes. Miles's failure could inspire despair, but it could also inspire recognition that challenging institutional power requires organization, coalition building, sustained collective effort that can't be eliminated as easily as a single journalist. What makes his story resonate beyond simple tragedy is the recognition moment, the point where Miles and audience both realize the mission was always impossible, that he was never going to escape, that documentation wouldn't matter. That recognition creates terrible clarity, strips away illusions about how power operates, and clarity, even terrible clarity, has value. Understanding that you're in an impossible situation doesn't make the situation better, but it changes relationship to situation, eliminates false hope that might lead to additional suffering. Miles achieves something beyond his intended mission. He becomes evidence himself, proof of what institutions will do to threats, demonstration of how power maintains itself through elimination of witnesses. His erasure is a message about what happens when you genuinely challenge concentrated power without protection. That message is bleak but informative. It tells potential future whistleblowers and investigators what they're really facing, allows them to make informed choices rather than operating under illusion that truth carries inherent power. We keep watching Miles's ordeal because it shows us something true about a world that polite society prefers to obscure. Power protects itself ruthlessly. Institutions value self-preservation over justice, and individuals challenging those structures risk absolute destruction. That truth is uncomfortable, but engaging with uncomfortable truths is part of what horror does. It forces us to look at what we'd prefer to ignore, to sit with fears we usually suppress, to consider possibilities we normally dismiss, and sometimes confronting the worst possibilities prepares us for lesser versions we might actually encounter. If you've vicariously experienced absolute institutional betrayal through Miles's story, you might recognize earlier warning signs when facing your own institutional conflicts. You might seek allies and protective structures before going alone into danger. You might document carefully while also ensuring documentation has dead man switches that activate if you're silenced. You might learn from Miles's failures not that challenging power is pointless, but that challenging power requires more careful preparation than courage alone provides. Chapter 13, The Ghost That Remains. There's the final aspect of Miles's story worth examining: what remains after erasure. The Walrider continues existing with some configuration of Miles's consciousness within it. That continuation raises questions about identity persistence that extend beyond horror conventions into genuine philosophical territory. If some fragment of Miles persists within the Walrider, experiencing something like consciousness, is that continuation of Miles or a new entity that contains memory fragments of who Miles was? The question isn't academic when you consider real-world parallels. People with severe dementia whose personalities change dramatically while biological continuity remains. Consciousness uploaded to a computer in a hypothetical future. Any situation where the question arises, is this still the same person? Philosophers distinguish between psychological continuity and biological continuity as criteria for personal identity. Psychological continuity suggests you remain the same person as long as your memories, personality, and mental characteristics persist even if biological substrate changes. Biological continuity suggests your identity is tied to a specific body and brain regardless of psychological changes. Miles's situation challenges both frameworks. His biological continuity is violated. His body is invaded and transformed by nanotechnology. His psychological continuity is unclear. The Walrider's distributed intelligence might contain patterns derived from Miles's consciousness, but whether those patterns constitute Miles's continued experience or just information extracted from him remains ambiguous. This ambiguity is horror's final gift to Miles's narrative. He doesn't die cleanly, doesn't cease to exist in an unambiguous way that would allow closure. He's maybe dead, possibly continued, existing in a quantum state where both interpretations could be true simultaneously. That uncertainty is more disturbing than certain death because it prevents resolution, creates permanent question marks where conclusion should be. For people who care about Miles as a character, the ambiguity is cruel. You can't properly mourn someone who might still exist in some form. You can't celebrate their survival when that survival might be a complete loss of everything that made them themselves. You're stuck in liminal space between grief and hope, unable to fully commit to either. The ghost of Miles haunts the narrative precisely because his ending refuses to be ending. He's simultaneously gone and present, dead and transformed, erased and preserved. That paradox mirrors how trauma survivors often feel. Like some essential part of them died during trauma, even though they biologically survived, like they're ghosts of their former selves, present in body but absent in spirit. If the Walrider contains fragments of Miles's consciousness, those fragments are experiencing existence no human psychology evolved to handle, distributed across nanotechnology swarm, perceiving through mechanisms unlike biological senses, operating according to imperatives that might have nothing to do with Miles's original values or desires. That's not survival. That's something worse than death, because it's continuation without coherence, existence without identity. The cruelty of that fate exceeds simple termination. Death is ending. This is continuation under conditions that make continuation torment rather than gift. It's like being trapped in a nightmare you can't wake from. Maintaining enough consciousness to know you're trapped, but lacking agency to change your condition. The psychological horror of that state is nearly unbearable to contemplate, which is probably why the game doesn't dwell on it explicitly. But the implication remains, hovering at the edges of narrative conclusion. Miles might be experiencing something like consciousness within the Walrider, might be aware of what he's become, might be screaming without voice in prison made from his own transformed biology. That possibility is more horrifying than any explicit gore or violence in the game because it's existential horror, psychological hell that persists indefinitely without hope of escape or resolution. Miles Upshur walked into Mount Massive Asylum believing truth mattered, believing documentation creates accountability, believing someone needed to bear witness even when witnessing was dangerous. He left, if leaving is the right word, as distributed intelligence within nanotechnology swarm, individual identity dissolved, mission failed, evidence destroyed along with his autonomy. His story refuses every comfort we might seek from horror narrative. There's no redemption arc where suffering produces growth. There's no justice where evil faces consequences. There's no survival where the victim escapes and heals. There's only systematic destruction of a person by institutions powerful enough to consume individuals who challenge it, followed by erasure so complete that even death is denied him. This resistance to comfort is what makes Miles's story valuable beyond entertainment. It's psychological inoculation against naive beliefs about individual power and institutional accountability. It demonstrates what happens when someone genuinely threatens concentrated power without adequate protection. It shows costs of witnessing, limits of documentation, and reality that sometimes courage and integrity accomplish nothing tangible. But Miles's story also demonstrates something else. The act of witnessing has value, independent of outcomes. He maintained his commitment to truth under impossible circumstances. He refused to surrender his professional identity, even when that identity served no survival function. He kept documenting when documentation became pointless because the compulsion to witness transcended rational calculation of costs and benefits. Whether that commitment represents virtue or pathology, wisdom or delusion depends on frameworks we bring to evaluation. What's clear is that Miles existed, witnessed, and was destroyed for witnessing. His erasure is proof of what he tried to expose: institutional power willing to eliminate anyone who threatens its operation. His absence is evidence. The documentation he gathered never reaches the public audience within the game's narrative, but his story reaches us, audience outside the fiction. We become witnesses to the witness, receiving testimony about what happens when individuals challenge institutions alone and unprotected. That meta-level witnessing might be only meaning his sacrifice achieves, not changing Mount Massive's outcomes, but informing us about patterns of institutional violence and individual vulnerability. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps bearing witness is inherently valuable, even when it doesn't produce immediate accountability, because accumulated testimony eventually becomes a historical record that can't be entirely suppressed. One journalist disappearing changes nothing. Hundreds of journalists documenting and disappearing eventually creates a pattern someone notices, investigates, exposes. Miles won't see that eventual accountability if it comes. He's gone in every way that matters, but his story persists, carrying forward his commitment to truth and his refusal to look away even when looking costs him everything. The ghost remains, whispering uncomfortable truths about power and powerlessness, about institutions and individuals, about the costs of challenging systems designed to devour challengers. That whisper is worth hearing, even though it offers no comfort, especially because it offers no comfort. The world needs witnesses willing to see clearly and document honestly, even when documentation carries unbearable costs. Miles was that kind of witness. His destruction doesn't invalidate his witnessing. It confirms why witnessing matters and why witnesses need protection that Miles never received. The story ends in horror and erasure, but the witnessing continues through anyone who remembers what Miles saw, what he documented, what he tried to expose, and what happened to him for trying. We become vessels for testimony that couldn't otherwise survive, keeping alive the record of one journalist's futile courage and complete destruction at hands of power he couldn't defeat alone. That continuation is Miles Upshur's ghost, and it deserves to haunt us.